Okay, we can start now. So the second major war that we'll be talking about is the Mongolian expansion. Can you tell us a little bit about it and why it's so important to know about?
So the Mongolian expansion was in the 1200s, so 1200s, when a ruler named Genghis Khan, a Mongolian ruler residing in present-day Mongolia, wanted to invade also lands, and once he started invading, it invaded most of China. It invaded it invaded all of the Middle East, and even went as far as invading Europe. And so why one reason is important is because if you look at Mongolia and then at its neighbor, if you look at Mongolia and a country a bit south from it, you have China, and to the west of China, you have the Uyghurs, and to the west of the Uyghurs, you have the Central Asian countries, and these countries, you have like Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan. The people of these countries are all descendants from, or all a result of the Mongolian expansion. It's the Mongolian expansion that gave rise to these communities, that gave rise to this specific ethnicity. So this is the reason why it's important. It's also important to because it shows us how an extent an empire can go to, how much it can go, and it also gives us an idea about uh, how bad sometimes wars can be, how tragic, how it can affect the people that wasn't that, for example, there was the Abbasid Caliphate, and the Caliph at that time, he didn't care. He was like he was like, okay, the war won't touch us. We have a very strong empire. And then the Mongols invaded the capital, and then destroyed and looted everything. And it was one of the and it was the end of the Abbasid Caliphate. So it shows us that sometimes it's not good to be arrogant and believe that, okay, we're free from war. It shows us that the war can hit us at any time. It doesn't matter how powerful you are, war can hit us at any time, and we should always be ready for it. Okay, so I'll move on to the other wars. You have World War One and World War Two. So I think this one, why. I think you already know why they are so important, because World War One and World War Two showed us how dangerous wars have become. Because prior to World War One, wars were fought mainly with swords, and were mainly fought on horseback and swords. And there wasn't a concept of chemical warfare, bombs, etc. There was guns that were being used, powder guns, but it wasn't really that deadly. But when World War One came, then with new advancement in technology and science, weapons became more deadlier, and once they became more deadlier, the casualties that they caused were horrific. People were shocked. Many soldiers that went to World War One returned with PTSD, and World War Two showed us again how with the advent of technology, with the advent of science, war have become very deadly, and it sort of gave humanity it sort of stopped humanity from it prevented humanity from pursuing future wars, from thinking twice before actually going to war. Because in where prior to these two wars, when a country would go to war, there wouldn't be much consideration about casualties and etc. But World War One and World War Two showed us that in modern times, with modern technology, going to war is not something that we should desire for, because of all the harms that can be brought. And then we have so we have okay, let's look at the Byzantine Rashidun and Safavid Rashidun war. And this is important because these two wars are what is or how or one of the pillars of how it helps us to understand how the Middle East is today. So long ago, when before today the Middle East is majority a Muslim majority area, but prior to the advent of Islam, the Middle East was divided between two empires: the Byzantine Empire and the Safavid Empire. And there was no Islam, and the Arabian Peninsula just south to the Middle East. So you have the Middle East, so you have Iraq and Syria, and then south to this country you have the Arabian Peninsula, which includes Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Qatar, and countries like Kuwait. So this area was ruled by tribal people, and then when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, started preaching Islam, there was an empire that was formed. It was called the Rashidun Empire, and this Rashidun Empire went on to annex most of Byzantine's land in the Middle East and Northern Africa, and the Rashidun Empire literally annexed the whole of the Safavid Empire. It literally brought the Safavid Empire to its knees, and this is how Islam spread throughout the Middle East, and it's what gave rise to future Islamic empires that rule over the Middle East, and also gives us an idea of how Islam came into the Middle East, and gives us an idea of uh, the situation of the Middle East today. And we have the American Revolutionary War,
Before we move on to that,
which
I'd just like to highlight the fact that geographical lines, the demarcation between two different countries, or something that's man-made, and in a lot of cases, these have been made not by the countries themselves, but by other countries which tried to gain power, which tried to restructure the government, the management, the happenings of the country. And I think were you trying to talk a little bit about this in this sense? Because there have been other cases of such types of influences, I would say.
Yeah, we could talk about that because long ago the Middle East was united. Even when the Rashidun Empire was no more, the Middle East was still united by empires. For example, you had the Ottoman Empire, you had the Abbasid Empire, and then once the British and the French they colonized the Middle East, when they were giving independence to these countries, the Middle East was no longer a united empire. It was divided into different countries, and you see. Today, for example, you have some people in the Middle East that want these borders to be erased, that want to go back to the old days. You have the Barfis. The Barfis are an Arab nationalist. Is an Arab nationalist group that want all Arab countries in the Middle East to be united to get rid of the borders. And you also have ISIS. ISIS want to go back to how the Rashidun Caliphate was, so uniting all the Muslim countries. And this is important. So this understanding the Rashidun Caliphate and the wars it undertook is important to understanding these agents that are in the Middle East today.
Okay, and now we can move on to American Revolutionary War.
Yes, so the American Revolutionary War was when citizens of the United States of America started revolting against the British that colonized the United States in order to create what we know today as the United States. Okay, I don't think I have to go much details on why it is important because this is what gives birth to the United States.
I think what would be interesting to talk about is also the civil war inside of the US itself. Do you know a little bit about that?
I don't know much about it. I don't know much about the civil war in America because I don't really look into that deep into it.
Okay,
but
so I think,
but I know, but it does. It's important to understand the civil war in order to understand what's going on in the US today, in order to understand the ideology held by white supremacists. Because you see, most of the white supremacists they hold the Confederate flag, which was used in the Civil War, which was a side in the American Civil War.
Okay. I think that's a fair expectation that the people who are listening to this and who will listen to this on YouTube, they can go and find a little bit more about the Civil War. And I think the main point that I wanted to highlight here was that wars are not necessarily between two different countries. They can be between communities. They can be between the country, the people, and the government. They can be between different sets of people in society, basically. So now we can move on to the Turkish War of Independence, I guess.
So the Turkish War of Independence was in the after World War One. when the Ottoman Empire was falling apart, its economy was crumbling, and it lost all of its territories in the Middle East because the French and the British colonized them, and it lost all of its lands in the Balkans, and it was starting to shrink on itself. And then there was a group of Turks, they were called the Young Turks, they formed a group called the Young Turks, and which started revolting against the Ottoman Sultan in order to change the regime of Turkey, in order to make a secular and modern republic. And this was the Turkish War of Independence. And it's important because, again, just like the Byzantine Rashidun Wars, it gives us an idea about the Middle East today, and it also gives us it gives us an idea about the rise of secularism and modernism in the Middle East, because Turkey was the one that started this movement, that started the movement of secularism, and then you had the Ba'athists that followed, that adopted the concept of secularism. So it's important to look into this war too. It didn't involve much casualties. It was more like a coup, but it is referred as a war. It is referred as a war.
I think it's really interesting how we can actually source certain sociological uh, events, sociological phenomena, rather, from wars. And in case of secularism, I think it had a long history in not just wars, but also in trying to get to a fairer society. I would say it has not necessarily achieved that goal. There's a lot of debate about secularism, especially as it is in France and as it is in Quebec. Um, Two very strict forms of secularism, but it's interesting how war connects to those. And I think that will lead us a little bit into the next part. So, about cross disciplinary approaches to understanding war and what happens in wars. So, the first thing that we'll look at is we've talked a lot about historical wars because it's not just the wars that are happening right now, but there's been a lot of wars in the past that has affected a lot of things. Actually, they have affected, for example, what we talked about was the geography. um, we talked about the religious conflicts that are still happening and the religious justifications given for wars. That has a root in history. Do you want to talk a little bit more about this, or do you think we've covered enough about it?
Uh, I think we've covered most of it. But one thing that I would add is that I think most people know is that as history progress, especially as from the 1900s till today, there has been a decrease in war. Okay, we're now living in a more peaceful era, especially with the United Nations and with different sets of measures taken in order to prevent future wars.
Do you think that has a
Yeah.
history in violence? That previously we were more violent, and with the rise of civilization, our violence caused higher scale wars and higher scale violence again. And now that we have more of ordered society, I would say, um, does this ring a bell? Does this make any sense?
I wouldn't really agree that an ordered society would be a society that would be peaceful towards other societies. A society can be very orderly, can be very, let's say, be very powerful, very. It could be a model society, so the people there are very nice, they are disciplined, and they are not lazy, they work well. But this doesn't mean that it will be, yeah, that they don't want other countries, they don't want to invade other countries. It would be they could in fact, on the contrary, they could find themselves superior, say, okay, we're disciplined, but does that mean we're superior, so we should invade other countries in order to teach them discipline? So it doesn't have an order society isn't necessarily a society that won't go to war to others. It can
That
be a
re-
peaceful society, but that doesn't mean that it would be peaceful towards other societies.
That reminds me of of a Hindu mythology book that I was reading, where the side that was more orderly was trying to invade the side that was chaotic, with the justification that they would be um, enlightening the ones that are chaotic. I think that's interesting.
Exactly. And if you look at history, we have a few examples. For example, we have the British Empire that started invading other countries because they believed that they were more powerful, more superior, more orderly, and that other societies were barbaric, and that's why they invaded in order to propagate the civilization and the civility to others.
So, what about science and war? I think this one is a little bit broader. There's a lot to talk about. So, just a few highlights, a few thoughts about it that people can then go and research more about.
Well, whenever what I would say is that war has helped science to develop. For example, today we have helicopters, have helicopter technology, and when did helicopter technology appear? It appeared during the Vietnam War when the United States started going to war when we went to war in Vietnam. Then the helicopter was invented in order to aid for war, and today the helicopter is used for a variety of useful purposes. And I would like another thing I would like to add is that war can help science to progress because it acts as a motivation war can be used as a motivation in order to motivate others to research into building more scientific adventure, because a lot of times a country having more scientifically advanced will be able to produce better technologies which can give them a better edge in warfare. So I believe that war helps science to progress.
I think an important aspect of this would be the space war, which is, I would say, war in parentheses. So because not everybody would consider space war as something as violent, but it's still something that's talked about. So space war
Well,
has.
even for the space war,
Mhm.
the space war didn't start because the United States and USSR at first they didn't want to get to space. How it started is that they were experimenting. They were trying to see. They were trying to develop high long range missiles, and in trying to develop long range missiles and in developing long range missiles, the idea came that okay, but what if we launch people using this missile technology? What if we launch people in space? And this is how actually the space war started.
Okay.
It just thought by it wasn't the idea to send people to space, it was the idea to make long range missiles, and then it evolved into sending people to space.
Yeah, so that's another kind of war that I think is interesting to consider, even especially in GPSs, and especially when other people might not think that this is a war as such, but it's still here. So the last one would be the role of art in war. Can you talk a little bit about this, please?
And yes, of course. So where do we see art in war is first of all in posters. Okay, when the United States during the Cold War era, when the United States would go to war, it would print out posters about a United States soldier that is going to war in order to some sort of liberate people. And this is a way that art is used in order to encourage the people, in order to make people support the war. So this one role of art into making posters, and art it doesn't also involve posters, it also involve music. For example, martial music in war, some in order to induce people to incite people for war. A country or an organization might use music in order to encourage them to go to war. And a good example of that is is a terrorist group ISIS, where they would release poems called nasheeds that would incite people to go to war, and they did it so well. They released in Arabic. They also released in other languages like English, French, Mandarin, German, and this helped radicalize people and help people to join in, and also incited people to carry out terrorist attacks. For example, ISIS released a song called Ma Vengeance, which was a French song where it induced people to carry out terrorist attacks in France. And it worked, and there were people that carry out terrorist attacks to these songs. And of course, you also have countries that would release patriotic songs. For example, Saddam Hussein's Iraq would release patriotic nationalistic songs in order to incite people, in order to make the local population support the war in Kuwait.
I think we also have the interesting part of media, and I think we'll start talking about this in the transdisciplinary considerations. So I think we'll move on to this. How media, how literature works. So before we get to that though, so how does the law, how does social structure change during the war?
Well, first of all, when we look at the Cold War between the United States and the USSR, one one change that we see in the law and structure is that people have to pay more taxes in order to support the war. And you also have new criminal laws during a war. Most of the time, the enemies, for example, let's say I'm in a country, it's facing war against another country. There will be new laws that would that would not permit me in order to support the other country. For example, if I distribute some contents that belong to that, for example, I distribute some media content from the other country, there might be laws that will be introduced in order to ban the distribution of such copies. For example, the United States, when they they had to ban certain Muslims from talking on certain topics such as wala wal bara or jihad, when the United States started the war on terror. There were new laws introduced that ban certain activities, and you could also have discrimination. For example, let's say when the United States went to World War II, and it fought Japan, there were some Japanese that resided in the United States, and these Japanese were victim to racism and victim discrimination in the United States. And even the Muslims in as from after the 9/11 attacks, many Muslims were discriminated. Many Muslims residing in the United States were discriminated because of the United States actions in the war of terror.
Okay, and
And
I
you
think
could and
Mhm.
in more extreme cases, as demonstrated, there is a book called 1984. In most extreme cases, when there is war, there can be the government that is in place can become more authoritarian during war.
I think the book 1984 it really brings also the how do you call it, the concept of media, how important media is, how important controlling the perception of people is during wars, and I think that's the second we'll be covering. So what is the role of media in wars, and what is the role that they should play? So not just what it is that they have done, but also what do you think they should do?
So the role of media in war is to give an insight to the population on how the war is going on. So it's to give an insight to the population, because as what goes on the media is decide most of the time is decided by the government. The government they will have intel on the war, and then from these intels they will give the media, which will then give an insight to the population. And the roles I will start with the roles that it should play is to give is that it should give an image on what's happening on the battlefield, what's happening on both countries. This is what it should give, how one side is viewing the war, how the other side is viewing the war. So this is the role that it should play. But most of the times, what role would it play, for especially for government owned media agencies, is that they would give if most of the time they would give an image that the government wants the population to see. Because let's say if you have my country, I am the head of a country, I go to war to another country, and I commit a lot of crimes here. I commit a lot of war crimes. And most probably, I know that if my citizens knew about these war crimes, they would start revolting and they won't support what I did. So I use the media in order to tell them that there are no war crimes, so that I give them a false image so that the war support for the war can continue. But fortunately, today we have independent media agencies such as Vice News that cover such topics independently, and they don't side on any side. But still, for government-owned agencies, most of the time they won't give the correct image. They will give an image that they want the population to see so that the war can continue. Because if the population starts revolting against the government, against the war, then the government would lose. They would lose money. They would lose many things. That's why the media is very important in order for a war to go on.
I think the next part that we want to talk a little bit about is war and peace education. So how do countries, the first thing that they do is control the media. The governments control the media. The second thing that they do is control what kind of information that the people growing up in that country, that the people are learning about, changes. So would you talk a little bit about this, please?
Well, just like the government controls the media in order to control what you're feeding, what information you're feeding the population, in order to control them, in order to in order to make the citizens act in a way that will be beneficial to the government. Is the same applies for education. You're in education, you're supplying information to your citizens, and in when it comes to education, most of the time it would be children, and children are more easily influenced because their frontal lobe is not developed yet, which is responsible for critical thinking. They are more easily brainwashed. They are more easily convinced. So a leader that wants a nationalistic leader that wants to invade other countries, for example, Hitler, when he would educate and when he would choose a curriculum for children at school, when he would choose a curriculum, he would he would manipulate it in such a way that the children would grow up that the children would grow up and they won't find anything wrong with war. They won't find anything wrong with fighting and killing other communities. And this applies for, if you look at all terrorist organizations or countries that go to war, you will see that they manipulate the education in such a way that that the child grows and so the child grows in an environment where he or she will justify war. If you look at Imperial Japan, they manipulated education in order to create citizens that would support the wars. If you look at ISIS, when ISIS controlled half of Syria and half of Iraq, when in the education system that it implemented, you would see that it would teach the children to go to war. It would teach children to glorify warfare. And yeah, so this is a very important tool if you want your citizens in order to fight, to support wars, to support your wars, especially your wars. You have to control the education, because control the education is how you control how they grow up. And if you can control how they grow up, you can control the ideologies. And this is very important. In fact, it's pivotal in getting a population that would support you in your wars.
I think that
And I
talks a
talk
little bit
about,
about the
yeah.
next point about ideology, how important ideology is. So both media and education actually help to cement that ideology of the governing party, of the people who are on the side of war in the country that you're in. And yeah, so do you want to add anything else on this part?
Well, I believe that basically the war would stem from an ideology. If you have an ideology that supports warfare, then where would the war come? It would come from this ideology. This ideology would make the person go to war. And if you have another ideology such as pacifism, where it is immoral to engage any sort of war, then such person won't go to war. Because if we look if we look closely, we will see that what's more dangerous, in fact, it's not the guns, it's not the bullets, it's not the bombs that are dropped, it's the ideology. Because what determines whether the person will shoot another person or will drop a bomb is the ideology. if the ideology is a war ideology, then the person would do war things. But if the person does not have this ideology, no matter how many bullets you give him, how many bombs you give him, how many weapons you give him, this person he or she won't fight, because ideology is not there. The ideology for war is not there. So yeah, it's very important. And ideology it determines whether a person will go to war or not.
And then lastly, the last thing that we cover is the relationship between psychology, war, and terrorism.
Okay.
So you can talk
Following
a
from
little bit
the
about it,
yeah,
and then I'll explain a little bit more about it.
okay. So I think there's something called the origin personality type. I think.
The
Uh,
Jungian,
do-
the Jungian
yeah,
archetypes. Yeah.
The Jungian archetypes, and I think you should talk a bit more about that because you know more a bit about that. And this is related to psychology. It explains what makes a person love war, what makes a person uh, be comfortable with the idea of war, and what makes a person engage in warfare. And psychology is also important because there's a clear relationship between psychology and terrorism, because in order for one to engage in terrorism, he or she would have to be radicalized. He or she would have to be sometimes brainwashed. And in order to brainwash someone, you have to play heavily on the psychology. You have to identify the person's weaknesses, the person's mental weaknesses, and it plays a lot on psychology. The process of radicalization, it plays a lot on psychology. And radicalization is not only for terrorism; it can also be used for war. And in order to induce someone, in order to incite someone to war, in order to incite someone to go and kill others, you would have to play on the psychology of the person, because especially if the person is a grown up, is a grown up man or woman who had an education, had a peaceful education, and never accepted the ideas of violence, lethality, and conflicts, then you have to play on psychology. You have to know a bit on psychology in order to turn this person in your favor.
So what I'll do is I'll just briefly explain a little bit about psychology, and that way we can have some time for the Q&A if ever anybody has questions. So in terms of psychology, what I would say is that in terms of the archetypes, these are personality traits that people uh, have an intuitive understanding of, so that if I tell you about the hero in movies, you automatically have a certain conception of what the hero is, and that's one type of archetype actually. And for somebody to be able to rationalize war, they need to have archetypes of war, of the government, of the people involved in war, so the soldiers. And even for terrorism, when you think about it, the terrorist himself does not think he's a bad guy. Most of the time, I think the person who is a terrorist will think that his cause is just, that his cause is warranted. And how do you reconcile that aspect of something that most people would think is evil, something that's hurting other people, hurting civilians, and the terrorist team thinks that this is something just? And there's that idea of archetype again that comes in. And how do you actually view your models? How do you actually view the people who are telling you to go forward and wage war or do terrorist acts? I'll end the presentation on this one. So we have 2 minutes 45 seconds just for the Q&A. I won't record the Q&A, so feel free to just unmute and talk. So I've just stopped recording here.